A few days ago I had shared some thoughts on deep order, and today I want to delve a little further into it and talk about some design properties that emerge from deep order. And this will have implication in system design and organizational design. Now, just as a quick recap, I had looked at various patterns that emerge across the economy from the macro level to the micro level, therefore it's a fractal pattern, and identified that this pattern seems to have or can be represented by the metaphor of a seed growing into a flower. And there's three stages: the physical, the vital, and the mental. And so this is a pattern that occurs through time. So there's certain progress that is made that appears or manifests as these three phases: physical, vital, and mental. And this is a first level of deep order. And then I asked a question that, since this pattern occurs regardless of area or region of the world or time, it points to some deeper system properties, and identified these as something that occurs therefore in space. At every point in space there seems to be this fourfold deep order that we can give the name of omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnicaring. So this is the second level deep order. And then I looked at a mapping of time and space, where again time is the emergence of this pattern, this flowering pattern, and every point in space is represented by these, or flows from this deep order of omnipresence, omniscience, omnipotence, and omnicaring. And I posed a question, or came to some conclusion, that when we look at some time-space boundary, and I'll call it time-space boundary x plus n, and if you compare it to a time-space boundary x, then one thing you can say for certain is that at time-space boundary x plus n, there is more of the flower that emerges, and this flower reflects more of this deep order that exists at each point in space. Now, I had referred to this area here underneath a time-space boundary as a wedge of causality, and concluded that what it's telling us is that our causal models, our organizational and system causal models, can be redefined or enhanced by considering the properties of this wedge of causality, if you will. So let's look at some of these properties that exist in this wedge of causality. Now I'll say that first, there's a property of fullness. And by fullness, I mean that every single point that occurs in this time-space wedge is backed by this deep order. So there's a presence of this omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and omnicaring behind every single point. So there's a fullness from which everything emerges. Second, if we consider one point versus another, since it's the same fullness that backs every single point, we can say that there is an identity between one point and another. And that may relate to, very simply speaking, that one person is completely equal to another person, for instance, or one country is equal to another country. But we'll come to that at some other point. Also, another property that emerges is that of uniqueness, in that if you consider any point any single point is the product of a unique time and a unique space, and therefore it is by definition unique, even though there is identity. So there appears to be a uniqueness or an implicit differentiation that occurs in this wedge of causality. Now, I'll come to some more properties. So this is one class of properties. Coming to another class of properties, I would say that whatever occurs, the world as it manifests, any system or organization as it manifests, when we consider this wedge of causality, it's really emergent. So it's not that there is some kind of overarching plan that needs to be put in place, but there's an emergent property to how things develop. So it's organic and emergent. And as we move towards some time-space boundary, it's a result of many, many different things that are happening within any single vicinity. So therefore, as things happen, they're emergent. I would also say at the same time that there is direction. So even though things are emergent, but the very fact that at a time-space boundary X, there's going to be more of a flower that occurs than at some lesser time-space boundary means that there is some kind of implicit direction in circumstance. Another property is that of flowering, in that at any further time-space boundary, more of the flower that occurs through time appears than at any lesser time-space boundary. Another property in this wedge of causality is something that I would call alternative narrative, in that at any point what might be expressed is simply one of three different states. So it could be that seed or physical state, the stalk or vital state, or the flower or mental state, and depending on where we link onto or how we begin to perceive things, reality will unfold at one level or the other. So, for instance, if we perceive things from the physical, or seeing things always as fixed and determined by yesterday, that's going to create a certain reality for us, as opposed to if we see things as being purpose-driven and as expressing some deep intent that is necessarily going towards some direction. So that there's an alternative narrative that exists at every point in this wedge. Similarly, or another property that emerges, if we consider this reality here, then I would say that what tends to happen is that like attracts like. So as a result of which, a single instance of a pattern may seem to occur in a larger pattern, and because of that like attracting like, an even larger pattern, and therefore what we have is some kind of a fractal reality. And I would also say that there's an inherent property that I'd call intersection. And quite simply, the way that we can think about intersection is that if we have two journeys occurring in time and assume that one journey is stagnated at this level here, at the stalk level, then in order for this journey to continue, then quite organically what could happen is that there's another journey that it can intersect with, and the force of the intersection, which would result in chaos or in everything that we know being challenged, and there are many regions in the world that are going through this at the moment, that force of that intersection can cause both the journeys to continue on their respective paths. So there's something called intersection that happens in this wedge of causality. Now, there's another class of properties. So as we've looked at, there was one class categorized by fullness, identity, uniqueness, another as emergent, direction, flowering, a third as alternative fractal intersection, and there's a fourth class of properties that have to do with the living system that we exist in. And I would call one of these properties the property of remembering. And quite simply stated, if we think about this wedge of causality, it all emerged from a single point, if you will. You can think of that as the Big Bang, for instance, where all time and space was compressed and then emerged from this single point. So everything that exists here is a child of that single point. And if we can remember that, then we can remember that we existed, something in us existed before anything existed, and something of us exists in everything that exists. So there's something that I'd refer to as remembering. Similarly, there's something that I'd refer to as linking. And here, this is derived from this notion of fullness. So there's a fullness at every single point in this wedge of causality. And it's possible, no matter what orientation we have, what level of reality we might live at, it is possible to go deeper within and link to something primal that exists behind everything and from which everything is expressed. And that's this design, of these four guiding principles: omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, omnicaring, that exist behind every single point. So it's possible to link to it. And then it is possible to enter into much deeper relationship with the system that we live in. Being a living system, being that there's fullness behind everything, being that perhaps there's something that existed before and exists everywhere, we can begin to enter into a different kind of relationship with this system and in fact converse with it almost in order to solve any kind of design problem that we might have, or any kind of practical world problem or local problem that we might be experiencing. So again, these are 12 properties here, and certainly not exhaustive, but some properties that come to mind when we consider this wedge of causality. And these properties can be leveraged to look at or to address any kind of problem that we might be facing in the organizational system space, and I'll go into that on some other occasions.